In his famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, Winthrop insisted that the people settling in New England had to get along with each other. Well, didn't happen. As soon as they settled, they started to have a good number of dissenters among them, people that didn't see things the way that Winthrop saw things, Winthrop and the people who were his friends and closest colleagues. So we want to talk about a few of those dissenters and why they're important to the unfolding of the story of American history. Let's start with Roger Williams. Roger Williams, a highly educated, respected minister. He was respected among the Puritans and that sort of thing. But his main point was that there has to be an absolute distinction between the government, between the secular world, and the church, the spiritual world. And he pushed that so strongly, he believed that the Puritans did not acknowledge that distinction. That was a distinction, actually, that Luther had developed in his On Secular Authority article that we had alluded to earlier. Now, Williams had three major complaints when he got to Boston. He said, I don't like this idea of purifying the Anglican church, the English church. He believed, like the Pilgrims did, it was so gone that you had to separate from it. So Roger Williams was a separatist. He didn't like the fact that the investors in Boston were still Church of England people, and the fact that the Puritans were not separatists. He also didn't like the fact that there didn't seem to be a separation of the government and the church in Boston. John Winthrop, who was the governor, seemed to have too much control over the church. And John Cotton, who was the minister, seemed to have too much influence and impact in the affairs of state. He didn't like that. He wanted a clear, what he called a wall of separation between the two. He also didn't like the fact that the Puritans came in and took the land in the name of the king from the Indians. He believed Indians are people too. Even though they're not Christians, they still have a right to civil law and to civil respect. And so the fact that they absconded the Indians' land, he felt was a violation of all that is right and good. Therefore, he declared the Puritan world basically illegit. Their charter, their project, everything they were doing. He would say this from the pulpit. This entire project that our friend Winthrop has initiated here is illegitimate. He also took issue with the fact that the king thought he and the rest of Europe were Christians when in fact, according to Roger Williams, they weren't Christians at all. He was a very bullheaded man, this Roger Williams fellow. He had a hard time getting along anywhere. He didn't like Boston. He thought they were too impure. So he tried to get a job down in Plymouth where the separatists were. That would be a good fit. Well, he was so radical that the people in Plymouth thought he was too radical. So they kicked him out, and he went back to, at this point, he went to Salem. He had already left Boston, went to Plymouth, now went back up to Salem, and he upset the people in Salem. He entered into a debate with John Cotton, the head minister of Boston, and he said you should never compel, in his argument with Cotton, he said you should never compel a non-Christian to pray. Cotton's response was, well, should you compel your little children to say grace before meals, for they have not yet been converted? And so Cotton said that Williams was a lunatic and a heretic and everything else. As a result of all this, Williams was banished. He was banished from Boston, and he was sent into exile after writing these various tracts against John Cotton and against John Winthrop. And so he's banished, and he goes to the south of Massachusetts and settles founds a colony. He names his colony after a famous place of exile. Back in the Roman world, if you were exiled, if you were a political exile, you would go to a place called the Isle of Rhodes, which is in the Mediterranean Sea. And so he considered himself a political exile, so he called his colony Providence in the region of Rhode Island, named for the Isle of Rhodes. And in Rhode Island, he insisted in his colony there would be a clear separation of church and state. Anybody could settle there who believed anything. It really didn't matter. You had freedom of religion. You had full civil rights, regardless of what your religion was. Now, what's interesting is it became the gravitational place for the Quaker movement. Quakers would go to Rhode Island because they would be welcome there. However, the Quakers hated the Puritans and vice versa. So one of the problems that Roger Williams had as a Puritan in Rhode Island was being oppressed by the Quakers that he had invited there. It became a very interesting dynamic. Nonetheless, Rhode Island stood and continued to stand firm on the doctrine of separating church and state, and it became the first colony really established on the principle of religious freedom. Now back to Boston. In Boston, there was a young woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson, and she dared to have a Bible study in her house. Now, the Puritans believed, according to Scripture, that a woman should not teach or exercise authority over men. So Anne Hutchinson already was suspect for teaching a Bible study in her home. But John Cotton, the head minister of Boston, really liked Anne Hutchinson, and he supported her. But John Winthrop didn't like her. He accused her of having what's called promiscuous assemblies. That is to say, she was leading men, which is something that she shouldn't do. Her influence kept growing, and her Bible study kept growing. In her Bible study, she made the statement that John Cotton is the only legitimate minister in New England. He's the only one who understood Luther's idea of being saved sola gratia, by grace alone. So that saying, when she came out in public and said John Cotton is the only true minister, it caused all the other ministers to put her on trial for slander. Because if you weren't John Cotton, you were obviously a fraudulent minister. So the fraudulent ministers put her on trial for accusing them of being false ministers. And they asked her on trial, how do you know this? Her answer was, God told me. And that got her into a good bit of trouble. Reverend Cotton didn't come to her defense at that point. In fact, John Winthrop sided with the ministers who felt embarrassed by her or insulted by her. So Winthrop banished her. His final judgment was that she needs to be exiled or banished from Boston. So she went, obviously, to the most logical place to go hang out with Roger Williams for a while. Well, she went to Rhode Island, but she wasn't happy there. So she went even further to the south, out to Long Island, where she had a very difficult pregnancy, and she was murdered by the Indians on Long Island, her and her entire family. And in Boston, in the press and whatnot, they rejoiced over the fact that this terrible woman, Anne Hutchinson, who caused so much dissension in this peaceful place of shalom, that she had been murdered, rightfully so, by God, as it were. So Anne Hutchinson goes down as one of our first sort of dissenters, speaking out on behalf of women, on behalf of the freedom of religion, but she in fact suffered for her strong views. The third major dissenter we need to talk about is Thomas Hooker. Now, Thomas Hooker was a little less of a radical, but he believed that you should have a vote in the civil government regardless of whether you're a church member or not. Winthrop believed you should only be allowed to vote if, in fact, you were a church member somewhere. So they had an argument about it. Hooker decided, look, I'm not going to convince you about this. I'm going to simply go to the south, just like Williams did, go a little bit farther south, down the coast to a place called Connecticut. So he's going to start the colony of Connecticut on the grounds that people who live there don't have to be church members to be able to vote in civil elections. And so we have the foundation of Massachusetts by Winthrop, we have the foundation of Rhode Island by Williams, and the foundation of Connecticut by Thomas Hooker. The last group, not a single person, but the last group of dissenters were a group called the Quakers. There was an Englishman by the name of George Fox. He didn't live in New England, he lived in England, But he started this new sect of Christians who believed essentially that even the Bible is not a real authority, it's more of an inspiration. The only authority that Christians should have is their conscience, what he called the inner light. And if you listen to the inner light, you're listening to God. You should have no pastors, no elders. No one should be in authority over you except the inner light. So in a Quaker quote-unquote church, although they wouldn't consider it a church, they would call it a meeting house. In a Quaker meeting house, no one gets up to lead. They all sit still, kind of in a semicircle, silently, until somebody feels that God is speaking to them, or the inner light is speaking, and that person stands up and they start to preach. Now, they very much took issue with the Puritans. And so one of the things they did quite frequently is to show their freedom against the Puritans' strict laws and their strict religion. On a Sunday morning, some of the Quakers might get together and go to a Puritan meeting house, a Puritan church service, entirely naked, to show and walk right into the church to show them that they're not under the strict guidelines that the Puritans were. They also threw glass and created riots and things of that nature, and a number of them were executed for their activities among the Puritans. They were considered to be absolute rebels without any law or any authority. They were anarchists, as it were, and they had no home. Well, by the end of the century, when we get to the colony of Pennsylvania or Philadelphia, we'll give the Quakers eventually their home. But in New England, the Quakers really weren't welcome anywhere except for in Rhode Island. But even there, they had issues. They did some strange things. In addition to their streaking naked, they believed in speaking in tongues. And perhaps the most famous thing that they were known for was that when the Holy Spirit hit them, they would quake, they would shake, they would convulse. And actually it was a sort of a pejorative. That was when they were called Quakers. They didn't take that for themselves. They actually called themselves the Society of Friends, but their enemies called them Quakers, and they adopted it just to kind of, I guess, be a little congenial in that regard. So the bottom line is this beautiful New Zion in the wilderness, this Boston, that was supposed to be this peaceful city on a hill where everybody got along well, turned into quite a controversial place with dissenters coming from every direction. There's others that I haven't mentioned, but those four main dissenters are a representative of how difficult it was to establish a place where everyone's in covenant, everyone's on the same page, and everyone's getting along.